Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Jackson. I'm a registered nurse and assistant professor in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Calgary. This is a quick video to talk about what should go in each section of a journal article. And so here I'm talking about an empirical article reporting a study. And the framework I'm going to use is generally for healthcare articles. So there are other kinds of journal articles, whether they're reviews or discussion papers. They're quite different in the humanities as well. So this is going to depend on what journal you're applying for and the specifics of your discipline. But this is a general overview as to what goes in an empirical paper that's reporting a process that has, research question, hypothesis, methods, results, conclusion type of thing. So before we get to the specifics of a paper, there's a few things to understand in general. When you're writing an article for publication, it is not like writing a paper for a class. It is a very different kind of writing. In a journal article, you are presenting new knowledge. And so you have to be as precise as possible. So how you do that is a few ways of using language. So one is consistency of terms. You have to use the same, most precise language throughout the whole paper. So if you are studying resilience, you need to use the word resilience over and over and over. Not resilient, not resiliency, not perseverance, not adversity, not hardiness, not grit, not anything else. You need to use the word resilience. You're probably also going to need to provide a definition of the word resilience, if that's, say, your main topic, because at one measure, there were over 120 definitions of resilience in the literature. So you need to be very clear on what you are talking about, and you have to be very consistent. So there are different definitions of resilience versus resiliency for people who know that literature. And if you go back and forth between those words without being clear about it, somebody who's an expert in the field will run the risk of dismissing your work because they'll see right away that you don't know how to use that terminology. It also doesn't always make for nice writing. Like if you're thinking about like prose that's nice to read, that's not necessarily what we're aiming for here. A paper should be engaging and it should be interesting to read, but you have to use consistent terms and not a lot of flowery language. There's lots of places where that's really effective. A journal article isn't one of them. So consistency of terms all the way through, especially when I'm reviewing qualitative work. I'm looking for, if they're talking about attitudes, I want to see attitudes all the way through, not attitudes, perceptions, experiences, behaviors, understandings of. It can get muddled very, very quickly. So make sure you have consistency of terms. Make sure your language is very precise and is also very concise. Most articles, you've got 3,500 to 5,000 words. And I know for beleaguered students, the idea of shorter word count is probably great. But as somebody who writes day in and day out, it's much harder to make it short than it is to make it long. So have a target journal in mind and an idea of what kind of word count you're going to be able to work with. Some that tend more towards the social sciences or humanities, you can have up to 10,000 words, and there's longer lengths available. So that varies by journal. You also need to make sure that you have all the right information when you're starting. You have permission to write this article from the other members of the research team, and you've checked with the supervisor about it and that kind of thing. So not going to get into those issues here specifically, but you're going to want to think about, do I have everything in place to write this piece? A final comment about what goes in overall in a journal article. You want to make sure you're using the right terms for your discipline and also for the right type of research method. So in a qualitative article, I would expect to see a findings section rather than a results. If you have to have a results because that's what the journal wants, it's fine, but generally qualitative results are called findings, quantitative results are results. You also want to make sure you're using the right kind of language for that method. So if you are talking about bias in qualitative research, that's an immediate red flag, because we don't deal with bias in qualitative research the same way that you do in quantitative research. So if I'm reading a qualitative article and I see things about like bias, validity, reliability, I'm scared. Same as if you had a quantitative paper and you're talking about the trustworthiness of something, that's gonna be a flag for reviewers right away. So make sure you're using the right kind of language for the method and type of paper that you're writing. So within a journal article, there's generally some key standardized sections. So there's introduction, background, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, and I'm going to go through each one. Out the top, you also have an abstract. You want to check whether the abstract is structured or unstructured, and the abstract provides an overview of the paper. Now, sometimes when I'm writing a journal article, I'm in a bit of a hurry and I just want to get the abstract done. It's the last thing in the way before I submit something. However, the abstract is sometimes the only thing someone will read, especially if your work is paywalled and they don't have access to it. So take the time to try and craft the abstract well, because it provides a summary of the whole article. So you want to highlight the most important points and assume that somebody doesn't need all the detail to understand how you got those points. Same goes for if a journal asks for highlights or what is known, what this article adds. Sometimes they want like 3 to 5 bullet points at the beginning. Those are also really important. Don't write them at the last minute, because again, that might be the only piece of your work that someone reads. So take time to like really nail down the wording that you want there. So when you're writing your introduction section, the introduction is the introduction to this specific paper. So what do you need to know to understand this specific manuscript? You want to give people enough introduction. Try not to confabulate introduction and background here. You need to give enough introduction so that people understand what issues directly inform this specific manuscript. This is different than the background section. The background section gives an overview of what do you have to know to understand the context of this topic. So your introduction is generally a page to 2 pages max, whereas your background can be a little more in depth. But you need to think that by the end of the introduction, your reader has to have all the basic information about this topic to understand why this manuscript is important. Otherwise, they won't keep reading. If you make them wait all the way till you get to the aim or the research question, they're going to lose interest. So make it very clear in the introduction, what do you need for this specific paper? Background is what do you need to understand the topic context. And you want to make sure you've narrowed that appropriately. So if you're talking about a specialized treatment program for addiction, you probably don't have to go back as far as what is addiction, especially if you're writing for an addiction journal. You might want to go back as far as sometimes oral treatments are insufficient and we need to offer injectable treatments, and then explain the context around that. So make sure you have the introduction to the paper, then the introduction to the context around the topic. Both of these need to be full of citations where you're showing what other authors have written and how you are going to add to their work or jump off from the work that's existed. The next thing you're going to do is state your aim. Sometimes this is in the form of an aim and an objective. Sometimes it's a purpose, or sometimes it's a research question. Depending on the context, any one of those can be correct, but don't mix and match. So don't have a research question and objectives, or an aim and a purpose. Have one of those things. So generally, if you're doing a quantitative study, you're going to have a research question and hypotheses. If you're doing a qualitative study, you may have aims and objectives. So This can vary quite a bit, but just make sure you've picked one. And this section is very short, couple of sentences. Generally, there's no citations in that. You're just telling the reader exactly what your purpose was for this work. You also want to be clear that you're talking about the purpose of this specific article. If you have a slate of 10 articles that are coming from one study, you may say, this was part of a larger project examining perinatal outcomes for mothers related to whatever topic. But this specific article, the research question was, does X intervention improve maternal outcomes related to Y context? Okay, so you can acknowledge it's part of a bigger whole, but you're writing about what is very specific to this project. So we stated our aim and our objectives, or our research question and our hypotheses. The next we get to the methods. Now the methods, the only citations you should have in the methods section are ones that are related to the methods. So you're talking about a methodological approach, and you were talking about maybe scales you're using, validated tools you're using, techniques you're using, and so you're citing those. But you're not especially talking about the issues that the paper is trying to address in a bigger picture. It's also important to note that you are writing the methods like a technical manual. So the idea is that someone could take your methods section and go and conduct the study exactly based on what you've written there, and that they could then replicate the study themselves. So this is a very technical, precise kind of writing. And so you have to write it as though it's a manual on, for those of us who are a little less young, on how to program your VCR or how to set up your Wi-Fi router. It needs to be exactly precise. And so when you're going through the methods for a qualitative paper, you want to talk about the design. So, and make sure qualitative authors want to know like the subset of the design. So I'm using grounded theory, the Charmaz constructivist variant, or I'm using phenomenology, looking specifically at Smith's IPA as the approach. If you just say something like I'm doing phenomenology, right away a qualitative reviewer will get nervous because they know there's lots of different subvariants of phenomenology and hermeneutics and what is considered that method. So you need to be really clear which strand of any given qualitative method you're using, which theorist, and like make sure you're citing the main texts. If the only ones you're citing are the like introduction to methods books, that will alarm reviewers as well. So you need to make sure you're including at least a few citations of the person who got this method going. And make sure you're confident in who that is and what this is about before you get started. So you're talking about your method, you're going to talk about how you recruited participants and who those participants were. So the recruitment is how did you get at them? And the participants was like, who were they? Not in terms of their names, but what were some of the characteristics you looked to include people. So they were from a single province, or they were from a single state. They were recruited all across the UK. You also want to talk about the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So people did participate in the study if they had these characteristics, but they did not participate in the study if they had those characteristics. You also want to acknowledge the setting in here. So that could be the specific geographic setting, but more likely it's going to be, you know, a large hospital, their intensive care unit, which has 30 beds, or they have a staff of about 150. You want to give someone a sense of magnitude so that they can know, is there a hospital where they might be applying this knowledge? Is it going to be comparable, or are we talking about two different things? We want to talk about data collection. So that's how did you follow the data collection approach outlined in this method? And then how did you actually do the nuts and bolts of it? So You could say something like, thematic analysis allows for a variety of data collection techniques. In this study, we conducted one-on-one participant interviews. So that's referring to the method. In terms of the nuts and bolts of it, you want to say we interviewed 21 participants for 45 to 60 minutes each on Zoom. We kept the audio recording from Zoom and we transcribed that, or we used the transcript directly from Zoom, verified from the audio. So that's where the precision comes in of like, this is how we enacted what is identified as a good method to collect data. Data analysis, you want to talk about how you organized and made sense of those data. One trick to avoid here is do not say that your software like NVivo analyzed your data for you. It did not. In qualitative research, the researcher analyzes the data, and a software like NVivo, Atlas TI, whatever you might be using, that is your data management system or your data organization system. So make sure you refer to it as such because it didn't do the work, you did. In a qualitative article, you also need to, in your methods chunk, you need to talk about rigor. Usually this is the Lincoln and Guba model for rigor, but there can be others. You also need to talk about reflexivity. So we're not talking about bias, but instead, how do you think about your role as the researcher in this topic? Finally, you need to go through ethical considerations. So that includes both we had ethical approval from the Research Ethics Board at this institution, this number from this date to do this research, and additionally, the other elements that promoted good ethical practice in general. So this could be things like saying that, we kept the data on a secure server, we confirmed, we had a signed consent form, but we also got verbal consent before we started an interview, and the techniques you generally use to promote ethical research. So if your word count is short, some of this can get condensed, but the ethics is a section that never gets cut. You need to make sure you've got that information in there. So squeeze from other places if you have to, particularly the background of the discussion, but don't ever squeeze the ethics section. Now, if you're doing a quantitative study, your method section is similar in terms of intent. You're going to talk about your design, your setting, then your participants, how they are recruited, and what sampling strategies you may have used. So random sampling, however that was structured, inclusion, exclusion criteria. And you also need to talk about your power calculation or how you determined what an acceptable sample size was. Then you need to describe the variables that you've measured and how you measured them. So you want to make sure that you're covering, I used the Connor-Davidson resilience scale, the 10 question variant of that, and I had permission, which is different than the 2 question variant or the 20 question variant. And you have to acknowledge that you've checked that you can use these scales or that they have a Creative Commons license and they're in the public domain. You need to describe each scale, talk about its reliability. So you probably want a Cronbach's alpha from other studies and some psychometric testing that's been done to say this is a good tool to use. You may also want to highlight if you're using a translation of a scale that you cite the original and then the translation for Dutch or Japanese or whatever tool is appropriate for you. You need to talk about bias mitigation, anything you did to reduce bias within the study, and then also your statistical methods. So how did you do a stepwise regression analysis and why was that the preferred approach? So you can go through and explain these are the analyses that we're going to do. They need to be precise in both quantitative and qualitative methods, but quantitative methods, you do have to be really, really precise here because that's setting you up for what your results are going to be, is how you designed all of these analyses. So you want to be really careful with that. You're going to talk about how you collected data, how you dealt with any missing data, and then how you analyzed your data and what software may have assisted you. Did you write the code for the software to run the analysis? Sometimes that's included as an appendices. And then finally, you're going to end off that section as well with ethical considerations. And same thing to think about. Ethics doesn't get squeezed. So squeeze other parts of the papers if you're short on words. But above all, we need to demonstrate that we had integrity with our research. So then we come to the results or findings section. The first section of this is always table 1, describe the participants. It might not actually be table 1. You may have tables previously in your manuscript, but generally table 1, describe the participants. So your first section of the results is talking about who are the participants in this study and what are their demographic characteristics. Even with qualitative work, my personal preference is to avoid describing them one at a time in any kind of way. I think that runs a risk of data breach or possible identification. It's much better to present them in an aggregate table. So you can say we had this many men, women, non-binary folks. We had people who identified their racial or ethnic background as A, B, C, or D. We also looked at other factors like, did they work part-time or full-time? What was their mean household income? Things along those lines. So you want to also offer a comment on the context of on the participants. So if you do a nursing research study, your sample is going to be 88 to 92% female, more than likely. However, that is reflective of the nursing population in just about every country in the world. So you don't need to say that that's a limitation of the study because that reflects the population of nurses. So you may want to offer a comment that, yes, there's very high number of females in this study, but given that we're studying nurses, we expect that. That's not a problem with our data. This is the way that this has been correctly analyzed. So first part of the results, describe the participants. For a qualitative paper, second is describe the context. What is the context in which this study occurred? So that people can understand the findings that come after. So the context may be this research occurred in a red state or blue state, or this research occurred in a time of civil unrest, or this research occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic, so that people have some ideas as to how to locate what went on here. Now, you don't have to describe every single contextual factor, but if there's anything that might give someone pause about, before I implement this, do I need to think about this factor that might have been in the background? So if you're measuring burnout levels, you need to say this was done during the COVID-19 pandemic, because that is naturally going to increase the burnout levels. So we would have to take those results into consideration in that way. So we're talking about context. Then present your, generally in qualitative research, present your themes. You want to give a brief overview of the themes, and then theme 1, theme 2, theme 3, and any sub-themes. Now, when you're doing this, you need to make sure that your results are appropriately analyzed. So if you have 9 themes and 17 sub-themes, you haven't done enough analysis, and you need to go back and analyze your results further because you haven't synthesized them enough. So you should be looking at like 2 to 5 themes with 2 or so sub-themes for each theme. You can have fewer. Sometimes there's cases where there could be more. This is method specific, but in general, if you have reams and reams of themes, as a reviewer, I would say your data are underanalyzed and you need to go back and create more synthesis here. So ethics notwithstanding, the results is the most important section. For academics, this is usually all they read because they know the introduction and the background. They might glance at the methods to see what you did, but they want to read the results. So it is important to preserve the word count of the results as much as possible. When you're presenting qualitative findings, you want to have your themes, and each theme needs to be supported by a participant quote or a photo or whatever you're using as your data. There needs to be an example, a minimum of one, to support each theme. You also want to make sure that your examples are spread out. So don't have participant 1 mentioned 6 times, but nothing from participant 7. You want to make sure that you try and include an example from each participant somewhere in the results. It's not always possible depending on the number of results that you have, or the number of themes relative to the number of participants, but you want to try to put that in there. So you're going to present your themes, and then at the end have a brief conclusion of like, this is what these themes all mean. In the results section, there should be no citations. This is your work, what your study has produced, and this is original knowledge. So this is not the place where you're unpacking the meaning and the significance of all these results necessarily. This is the place where you're talking solely about what you found. I spend more of my time in qualitative than quantitative research, but the results section for a quantitative paper is very clear kind of set of structures that are expected. So I would defer to the people that you're working with there. Generally, table 1, participants, table 2 is frequencies, table 3 is correlations, and table 4 is your regression analysis. And you're going to need to make sure that you present every variable that's there and explain how much, if any, missing data you dealt with and how you manage that. I am very scared if I see that somebody's measured 4 variables, but in their tables they're only presenting 3. So make sure that you're sharing all the information, whether it is what you hope to find or not. It all has to be accounted for. So you want a very high level of consistency between your method section, what you said you were going to do, and your results section, what you actually present. So results are our work, no citations in there. Then we come to the discussion. So the discussion is full of citations. So the discussion has kind of 2 features. One is it sort of unpacks the significance or the meaning of your results or findings, but also it puts it in context with the other literature. So you're not just talking about what you did and what you found and why it matters. You also have to put that relative to other pieces. So these findings are different than the findings from Jackson et al. 2020 because our participants focused on this factor, which is different than what's been documented in the literature before. Therefore, our study presents a new way of understanding this that builds on what's been done previously. You might also say that this is the first time we've done this, and so we don't have a lot of direct comparisons. What we are finding is that this is related to these issues in these ways. Jackson et al. Covered the same topic in a different population, and so we're finding some crossover with what we're covering here. So you want to place your results in the context of the existing literature. This is not a repeat of the introduction and background sections, because that was the information we needed to understand the paper. This is unpacking what we got and how it fits into, or doesn't, the bigger conversation about these topics. You're also going to need to pick some of your results. You're not going to be able to discuss every subscale or every sub-theme that you found. You want to pick out kind of the 3 most striking things that came from your experiment or your study and talk about, we've never found this before, this is a big deal. Or we have found this before, and our study shows that this is still an issue even after we've tried an intervention. And it's also fine to say our approach did not work, because now we're saving a lot of research time and money and resources for other people so that they know that this thing didn't work and could build in a different direction. So you're talking about what was the main stuff you found and what does it mean? How does it relate to other literature? In the discussion, you also have the limitations, recommendations for practice or implications for practice, and a future research section. Some of this depends on the preferences of the editors and the journal authors, but you'll need to look at the guidelines for that. In general, limitations don't go through what was wrong with your study. I've seen some people write longer limitations than they write their methods. And so we need to be proud of our research and say, look, there's no such thing as a perfect study. Purpose of the limitations are like what things are a little bit that you have to take into account, what maybe went wrong that needs to be taken into account, or what is specific to the context that has to be taken into account. So for example, you might say something like, we only did this study in one province in Canada. But like, why does that matter? Why is that a limitation? So you may say, we only did this in one province where there is a single health authority across the entire province. Therefore, it may not translate to different provinces that have multiple health authorities or have different ways of organizing their healthcare services. You might also say, you know, the bulk of these participants were recruited in London. So if you are in Scarborough, this might not apply to you because we are dealing with different magnitude of the services that are available or different political context. Maybe it's a conservative government versus a more leftist government or something along those lines. In some of our studies, we have to contextualize that in Canada, you cannot live outside 365 days a year, most places in the country. So that is different if you're studying homelessness than somebody who's doing work in Los Angeles, where you can, for all intents and purposes, you can live outside 365 days a year. So the limitations is where you're providing caveats or information that people might need to know before they apply the findings of your study. You might also acknowledge we only had 8 participants, we wanted 20. The subtext is we ran out of time or out of money, or we just had to get it done. And to be honest, that's 99% of the time, and everybody can kind of get on board with that. It doesn't negate the work you've done. It just means that we might need to build on it more before we say, okay, we're going to go change healthcare tomorrow. So that's your limitations. Keep a lid on that. Stay focused on what is the most important thing someone else needs to know, not what's every flaw in my study. Your recommendations for practice. What do we need to do now? What should we do with this information? And you want to think about this in a few different ways. You can have recommendations for clinical practice, like we should no longer order this test because it's as good as chance in determining if someone actually has a problem. You can also look at managerial or leadership level implications. So we should not schedule nurses shifts with only 3 weeks notice. We need to be using 4 to 6 weeks as an optimal level. You might also look at policy recommendations. You know, hospitals should make sure they reinforce the Q2H turning policy, something like that. You can think of, so rather than just present a soup of things that we should do, break it into maybe different levels of hierarchy or different groups that who has the locus of control, or you can highlight by different priorities. The emergent issue is that we change our insulin protocols in intensive care. In the long term, we can look at, you know, creating different kinds of insulin that can respond to different situations, but like right now, this is the main thing we need to do. Then finally, in the discussion, you want your future research section. So this is what should the next researchers do? What is the next question? And it can be in terms of like the next study needs to factor in this because we didn't, or the next study needs to move on to intervention studies. So we don't need any more documentation of burnout. Everybody's burnt out. We've established that thoroughly. It is not worth any more taxpayer money to assess burnout. What we need are intervention studies to assess whether interventions are working. How do we actually fix this problem? So that's what you want to put in your future research, is not necessarily the next research question needs to be, although if you have a subsequent manuscript, you may slide that in there. But you want to talk about like, what are the next steps for the field? Finally, your conclusion. Make sure that you are not presenting any new ideas in the conclusion. No new ideas. You are only providing a condensed highlight of the most important points from your paper. There's also generally no citations in the conclusion. It's rather just a review of these are the main important things that we found and what we need to do about it. Finally, you'll have your references, and then you're going to have tables, figures, appendices. Appendices are a good place to put, especially for qualitative papers. If you're using an equator checklist, they want all kinds of stuff that you probably don't have word count to get in there. So for example, if they want to see your interview guide, that is a great thing to put in an appendix. And also for quantitative papers, you might put your code, you might provide references to your data set, your protocols, things along those lines. So I think that's mostly it. What I suggest for the people I work with is start with a document with these headings relative to whatever kind of paper you're writing. Put those headings in and maybe have in brackets as a placeholder, introduction, understand this paper, background, understand this topic with citations, methods, technical manual, citations only about methods, results, no citations, just what we found, discussion, citations, talk about how our work fits with other people's work, something like that. Have some shorthands there, and then put all the subheadings you need, whether it's design, participants, recruitment, setting, that type of thing. That way you're never starting with a blank page. And also, science in this way, when we're presenting new information, it's generally kind of formulaic. And that's for good reason. It enables us to tell quickly whether what we're reading meets with the expected standards of our discipline or doesn't. So this isn't a place to be wildly creative. Save that for your posters or your conference presentations or whatever other outputs you're making. But here, this is precise, clear, and it tells how you have contributed to the understanding of your discipline and how you have made new knowledge. So hopefully that's helpful. Happy writing.